At the edge of sleep, with the body heavy and the eyelids closed and the thoughts dissolving into fragments that no longer connect, a jolt arrives without warning. The whole body spasms, the legs kick, the arms flinch outward, the heart surges. You are wide awake, gripping the mattress with the vivid sensation that you were falling off a curb, through a floor, out of something high. The fall lasted less than a second. The physical conviction that it was real, that you were dropping through space, arrived with a certainty no waking thought could generate. You were lying in bed the entire time. The fall happened inside the brainstem, not in the room, and the emergency reflex that fired, the whole body extensor contraction that would have caught you if you had been falling, is the fastest motor response the human body produces. 80 milliseconds from detection to contraction. Faster than a voluntary reach, faster than a pain withdrawal, faster than a startle blink. The speed exists because the ancestral problem that built the reflex demanded it. Catching a branch during a fall from a sleeping tree required execution before the fall progressed beyond the reach envelope. 80 milliseconds. Survival demanded that width. Your brainstem fired it in under 80 milliseconds. The question is why the brainstem thought you were falling when you were lying on a flat surface in a dark room. The answer runs through a gravity sensor in your inner ear that never turns off, a motor shutdown that takes 15 minutes to complete, and a detection algorithm that has been running for 60 million years of primate evolution, optimized for a problem the human body solved 2 million years ago when it came down from the trees. The brainstem does not know you came down. Every night, at the edge of sleep, it checks. What is the gravity sensor and why does it keep running through the transition to sleep? Inside each inner ear, behind the cochlea, sit two small organs called the otolith organs, the utricle, which detects horizontal acceleration, and the saccule, which detects vertical acceleration, including the sustained downward pull of gravity itself. Each organ contains a sensory surface called a macula, a sheet of hair cells topped by a gelatinous membrane embedded with crystals of calcium carbonate called otoconia. The crystals are dense, approximately 2.7 grams per cubic centimeter, nearly 3 times the density of the surrounding endolymph fluid at approximately 1 gram per cubic centimeter. The density difference is what makes the system work. In a gravitational field, the denser crystals experience a stronger downward force per unit volume than the lighter fluid surrounding them. The crystals move relative to the fluid, and the relative movement is what the hair cells detect. If the crystals were the same density as the fluid, gravity would pull both equally, no relative movement would occur, and the sensor would be blind to gravitational orientation. The entire system depends on the density mismatch between the mineral crystals and the biological fluid they rest in. Gravity pulls the denser crystals downward relative to the fluid. The crystals drag the gelatinous membrane with them. The membrane deflects the hair cell stereocilia, the microscopic projections sitting on top of each hair cell. Deflection opens mechanotransduction channels through structures called tip links, filaments connecting the tip of each shorter stereocilium to the side of its taller neighbor. When the stereocilia deflect toward the tall edge, the tip links pull open ion channels at their attachment points. Potassium and calcium ions rush through the open channels. The hair cell depolarizes. A signal propagates to the vestibular nerve and reaches the brainstem within milliseconds. That identical mechanism operating in the cochlea, stereocilia deflecting, tip links pulling open ion channels, hair cells depolarizing. Same physics, different organ, different signal. The cochlea detects sound frequencies through vibrations transmitted from the eardrum. The otoliths detect gravitational acceleration through the weight of calcium carbonate crystals pulling on a membrane. One organ listens, the other one weighs. Both use the same molecular machinery to convert a mechanical force into an electrical signal the brain can read. Gravity confirmation runs continuously, every second, waking and sleeping. The signal it sends to the brainstem encodes a simple report: you are oriented vertically. The crystals are pulling at the expected angle, you are not falling. This confirmation runs all night, through every sleep stage, through every dream, through every transition between light and deep sleep. The otolith crystals continue their gravitational pull, the hair cells continue transducing, and the vestibular nerve continues delivering the orientation report. The gravity sensor never turns off because the brainstem never stops needing to know which way is down. This is how you maintain your position on the mattress during sleep. how you do not roll off the bed despite hours of unconsciousness, how the body preserves its spatial orientation through a night of complete motor suppression. The vestibular system runs independently of consciousness, independently of muscle tone, independently of visual input, providing the gravitational reference the brainstem requires regardless of what every other sensory system is doing. Gravity sensing stays on, but something else shuts down during the transition to sleep, and the shutdown sends a signal the gravity sensor cannot explain. Sleep onset is a transition that takes 5 to 15 minutes to complete, not a switch that flips in an instant. Saper and colleagues established the mechanism in nature. The ventrolateral preoptic area of the hypothalamus releases inhibitory neurotransmitters, gamma-aminobutyric acid and galanin, that progressively suppress the reticular activating system in the brainstem. The reticular activating system is the arousal engine. As the inhibition builds, muscle tone drops through descending suppression of the spinal motor neurons that maintain postural tension. The muscles that held your body upright all day, the extensors of the legs, the stabilizers of the trunk, the flexors of the arms, begin releasing their contraction as the inhibitory signal reaches their motor neurons one circuit at a time. Minutes, not seconds. During the transition window, the inhibition is incomplete. Some motor pathways are already suppressed while others remain partially active. Muscle tone is collapsing unevenly across the body, the proprioceptive system reporting a postural landscape that is changing moment by moment as different muscle groups release at different rates. The large postural muscles of the legs may release before the smaller stabilizers of the trunk. The shoulder girdle may still be holding tension while the hip flexors have already gone quiet. The brainstem receives a proprioceptive report that is internally inconsistent, some regions reporting stable tone and others reporting collapse, a pattern that resembles the partial grip loss of a primate whose hands are slipping off a branch at different rates, rather than the uniform relaxation of a body settling safely into a mattress. Sensory processing enters the hypnagogic state, the borderland between waking and sleeping where imagery becomes fragmented. Spatial perception distorts, and thought coherence dissolves into loosely connected associations. Now, 3 systems report to the brainstem about the body's position in space. The vestibular system, the otolith gravity sensor, continues operating uninterrupted through the transition. The proprioceptive system, the network of sensors in muscles and joints that reports body position and muscle tension, is collapsing as the motor inhibition progresses, and the visual system is offline, the eyes closed, providing no spatial reference at all. 3 inputs, 2 of them disappearing. And a brainstem algorithm that must decide, in real time, whether the body is safely falling asleep or dangerously falling. What does the brainstem do with this pattern? Integration of 3 inputs runs for postural stability, running a continuous computation that compares what each system reports against what the others confirm. During waking, all 3 inputs agree, and the agreement is what the brainstem interprets as safety. The otoliths report stable gravitational orientation, confirming which way is down with sub-second updates. The proprioceptors report stable muscle tone and joint position across every muscle group, confirming that the body is supported and the posture is maintained. The visual system confirms the body's orientation in space through the optic flow patterns and spatial references. The eyes track continuously. When all 3 channels agree, the brainstem maintains postural tone, and no emergency reflex fires. The agreement is the signal that means you are safe. The disagreement is the signal that means evaluate for a fall. At sleep onset, the agreement breaks. Proprioceptive input is collapsing as muscle tone drops. Muscle spindles, the stretch receptors embedded within the muscle fibers themselves, report muscle length continuously to the brainstem. During normal waking posture, the spindles fire at a steady baseline rate that the brainstem reads as stable tone. During sleep onset, the descending inhibition silences the motor neurons and the muscles lengthen as tension releases. The spindle discharge rate drops rapidly as the muscle extends passively. The specific pattern of rapidly decreasing spindle discharge is nearly identical to the pattern the spindles produce during an actual freefall, when the muscles extend under gravitational acceleration because the body is no longer supported. The brainstem cannot distinguish between the proprioceptive signature of voluntary muscle release during safe sleep onset and the proprioceptive signature of involuntary muscle extension during a fall, because both produce the same signal, rapid decline in spindle firing rate across multiple muscle groups simultaneously. Visual input is absent, removing the confirmation that would normally resolve the ambiguity. Vestibular input continues reporting stable gravity, but the vestibular signal alone cannot override the pattern the other two inputs are generating. A postural algorithm refined across 60 million years of primate evolution runs a simple conditional: if muscle tone drops suddenly and visual confirmation is absent and the body was recently oriented vertically, the most probable cause is loss of grip. The primate is falling from the sleeping branch. The algorithm cannot evaluate the probability of a bed because the algorithm predates beds by approximately 59,995,000 years. It cannot weigh the evidence of a pillow or a mattress or a darkened bedroom because none of these objects existed during the evolutionary timeline. The detection circuit was refined through natural selection. It evolved in an environment where sleep always occurred at height, where every sleeping primate was one relaxed grip away from a fall that could kill it, and where sudden muscle relaxation during sleep always meant the grip had failed and the fall had begun. A whole body extensor contraction fires, legs extending, arms flinging outward, trunk stiffening, the pattern that would have caught a branch or a neighboring limb during a fall from height. The reflex arc runs from the vestibular nucleus through the lateral vestibulospinal tract to the spinal motor neurons, activating the anti-gravity extensors in all four limbs simultaneously. Latency: under 80 milliseconds from mismatch detection to muscle contraction. The contraction pattern is specific to catching. The arms extend and abduct, reaching outward toward whatever surface might arrest the fall. The legs extend against the direction of gravity, bracing for impact or pushing toward a support. The trunk stiffens, preventing the body from folding at the waist during the deceleration a catch would produce. Every component of the motor pattern maps to the mechanical requirements of arresting a fall from height, a pattern that would make no functional sense as a response to lying in bed, but makes complete functional sense as a response to falling from a tree. The fastest motor response in the body, faster than any voluntary action the cortex could initiate because the cortex is not involved. The reflex runs subcortically beneath conscious awareness, executing before the thinking brain receives any information about what happened. By the time the cortex processes the arousal signal and conscious awareness returns, the reflex has already completed its motor program. The arms have already extended, the legs have already kicked, and the heart rate has already surged. You become aware of the jolt after it is over. The conscious experience of the jerk is the cortex receiving a report of an event the brainstem already handled. The same way you become aware of pulling your hand from a hot surface after the spinal reflex has already withdrawn it. I experienced the jolt differently the first night after I learned the three-input mismatch. The arms that flung outward were reaching for a branch. The legs that kicked were bracing against a trunk. The whole body extension pattern was the geometry of a primate catching itself mid-fall, and the brainstem that fired it was running an ancestral evaluation that had not updated its environmental model in 2 million years. Reflex fired and the body jolted, and then the image arrived. Did the falling dream cause the jolt, or did the jolt cause the falling dream? You remember it the other way. You remember falling, and then jerking. The memory places the falling image before the reflex, as though the image caused the jolt. The sensation was so vivid, the curb, the cliff edge, the staircase dropping away, that the causal sequence feels obvious. The dream caused the reflex. Chronology runs in the opposite direction. The vestibulospinal reflex fires in under 1/10 of a second, a subcortical, pre-conscious event the visual cortex has not yet participated in. The reflex execution sends an arousal burst through the reticular formation. The visual cortex, already in the hypnagogic state and generating fragmented imagery without waking coherence, receives the arousal signal and produces a brief falling scene, a curb, a cliff, a floor dropping away, imagery consistent with the motor pattern the body just executed. Conscious awareness returns. The brain encounters two events, a falling image and a body jolt, and assembles them into the narrative that makes causal sense. The fall caused the catch. Chronologically, the image came after the reflex. The brain reversed the sequence to construct a coherent narrative from events that occurred in the opposite order. This retroactive construction is a documented feature of cortical processing. The brain routinely assembles causal narratives from temporally disordered inputs, placing causes before effects even when the neural processing occurred in the reverse sequence. The mechanism operates through the same retrospective coherence system that makes you perceive a touch on your hand as instantaneous with the visual confirmation of being touched, even though the tactile signal from the hand arrives at the cortex tens of milliseconds before or after the visual signal, depending on the distance. The brain holds both signals in a brief temporal buffer and assembles them into a single coherent experience with the cause preceding the effect, regardless of which signal arrived first. The jolt triggered the falling dream. The visual cortex, having received the arousal burst from the reflex execution, generated the most contextually appropriate image it could assemble from the hypnagogic fragments already circulating, a scene of falling. The falling scene is contextually appropriate because the motor pattern the body just executed was a catching response, and the cortex, working backwards from the motor output, produced the sensory experience that would normally precede such a response. The visual cortex was recruited after the reflex executed, producing an image that the waking brain retroactively positioned as the cause rather than the consequence. Sequence evidence supports this temporal reversal, consistent with hypnagogic imagery research and the established latency differences between subcortical reflex execution and cortical image generation. The reflex completes in the catch interval. Cortical image generation requires 150 to 200 milliseconds at minimum. The reflex is finished before the image begins forming. The causal direction the memory reports is the opposite of the causal direction the timing requires. Well, the reflex fired because the falling assessment computation detected a mismatch. The image arrived because the cortex was recruited after the reflex. The question shifts: why does the reflex fire more on some nights than others? The answer runs through three conditions that each affect the transition window, the 5 to 15 minutes where the brainstem conditional is most vulnerable to the mismatch. Caffeine. Adenosine accumulates during waking hours, progressively increasing the pressure to sleep. Caffeine occupies the adenosine receptors without activating them, physically preventing the adenosine molecules from binding. The sleep pressure is still accumulating, the adenosine is still being produced, but the receptors that would translate the pressure into the inhibitory cascade cannot receive the signal because the caffeine molecules are sitting in the binding sites. Caffeine has a half-life of approximately 5 to 6 hours in most adults. A coffee consumed at 4 in the afternoon still occupies roughly 50% of adenosine receptors at 10 in the evening. The receptors are half-blocked when the transition to sleep begins, which means the inhibitory cascade that drives the transition must work against a background of stimulant occupancy that delays and stretches the process. When the caffeine is eventually metabolized and cleared from the remaining receptors, the accumulated adenosine rushes in, and the transition that was delayed now begins against a higher baseline of sleep pressure than would have been present without the caffeine. When caffeine wears off and the transition finally begins, the inhibitory process unfolds against a background of residual stimulant effect. The transition stretches, the window of incomplete motor inhibition extends. More time in the vulnerable state means more opportunities for the proprioceptive collapse to reach the pattern the detection circuit reads as a fall. The coffee you drank at 4 in the afternoon widened the transition window at 11 at night. Now, sleep deprivation. When the homeostatic sleep pressure is very high, the accumulated adenosine drives the transition more abruptly once it begins. Muscle tone drops faster and more completely. The proprioceptive collapse is sharper, a signal that more closely resembles the sudden grip loss of an actual fall than the gradual drift of a normal transition. The brainstem reads the sharp collapse as a higher confidence fall detection. The exhausted brain falls toward sleep faster, and the faster collapse looks more like the real thing to the ancestral computation that evaluates the input pattern. The rate of proprioceptive change is what distinguishes a gradual transition from a sudden one. A slow decline in spindle discharge over 15 minutes reads as safe drift, while a sharp decline over 3 to 4 minutes reads as a sudden release that the brainstem cannot distinguish from a grip failure at height. And then, stress. Elevated sympathetic tone during the transition keeps the reticular activating system partially active while the ventrolateral preoptic area is trying to suppress it. The body drifts toward sleep, snaps back toward waking, drifts again, snaps back. Each oscillation produces a partial proprioceptive collapse followed by partial recovery. The brainstem receives repeated approach to threshold signals, each one resembling the beginning of a fall, multiple opportunities for the mismatch to trigger. The stressed brain oscillates through the transition, and each oscillation presents the falling detection evaluation with a fresh pattern to evaluate. If you are exhausted, stressed, and caffeinated, you carry the longest transition window, the sharpest proprioceptive collapse, and the most oscillation simultaneously. The hypnic jerk fires multiple times before sleep finally consolidates. The multiple jolts across a single transition are multiple false alarms from one brainstem calculation, evaluating the same mismatch under the worst conditions. Disrupted transitions produce more firings. But the reflex fires at all, because of where primates used to sleep and how long the brainstem remembers. Why does the reflex persist when the problem it solved no longer exists? Primates have slept in trees for approximately 60 million years. Chimpanzees, orangutans, and gorillas build sleeping platforms in the canopy every night, selecting branches for structural integrity, weaving smaller branches into a stable mat, bending larger branches inward to form a rim, and positioning the completed nest 10 to 30 meters above the ground, a height from which a fall onto hard forest floor would produce skeletal injuries incompatible with continued survival in a competitive social group. The construction takes 5 to 20 minutes and is performed fresh each evening, an investment of time and energy that reflects the seriousness of the fall risk the sleeping platform mitigates. A chimpanzee that built a poor nest and fell during the night sustained injuries that reduced its reproductive fitness. A chimpanzee that built a secure nest and possessed a fast catching reflex as backup survived falls the nest failed to prevent. Goldberg and colleagues described the vestibular system's role in postural reflexes across primate species, documenting that the vestibulospinal reflex pathway is conserved across every primate lineage studied. The arboreal sleeping environment placed extreme selection pressure on the falling detection circuit. The primate who caught the branch survived the night. The primate who missed the branch fell 10 to 30 meters onto forest floor. The reflex needed to be fast, under a tenth of a second, because the fall accelerates under gravity and the branch moves out of reach within 200 milliseconds of grip loss. It needed to be whole body, all four limbs extending simultaneously, because the primate could not predict which limb would reach the branch first, and it needed to be pre-conscious, firing before the cortex could process the situation, because conscious evaluation takes 150 milliseconds and the branch is already gone. Hominins transitioned to ground sleeping approximately 2 to 3 million years ago, with the emergence of Homo erectus and the control of fire, providing predator deterrence that made ground sleeping survivable. 2 to 3 million years is approximately 3 to 5% of the selection window the reflex was under selection pressure. The reflex remains in the brainstem because the evolutionary pressure that would remove it, a fitness cost from jerking on a flat surface, does not exist. The jolt is harmless. It wakes you briefly, your heart pounds for 10 seconds, and sleep resumes. There is no selection against a reflex that carries no cost. Evolution removes traits through negative selection pressure, a fitness disadvantage that makes carriers less likely to reproduce. A reflex that wakes you briefly, accelerates your heart for 10 seconds, and allows sleep to resume within minutes carries no measurable fitness cost. The brief arousal does not reduce sleep quality over the course of the night. The heart rate surge does not damage the cardiovascular system. The momentary fright does not produce lasting psychological harm. Without a fitness cost, the negative selection pressure required to erode the circuit does not exist, and 3 to 5% of the reflex's evolutionary history, the time since ground sleeping began, has produced no measurable reduction in the reflex's prevalence or sensitivity. Oswald documented the phenomenon in Brain in 1959, and Broughton classified it among the normal motor events of sleep onset in 1988. The hypnic jerk is a normal brainstem reflex that generates a false positive from an input pattern that was a true positive for 58 of the last 60 million years. Electroencephalography confirms no epileptiform activity during the jerk. The electrical pattern recorded during a hypnic jerk shows a normal vertex sharp wave, a transient associated with the wake-sleep transition, followed by the motor artifact of the contraction itself. No spike and wave pattern, no rhythmic discharge, no post-ictal suppression. The electrical signature of the hypnic jerk is the signature of a brainstem reflex, not a cortical seizure. The reflex occurs exclusively at the wake-sleep transition. Approximately 60 to 70% of the population experiences hypnic jerks at some point, with prevalence increasing during periods of stress, caffeine use, or sleep deprivation. Frequency varies across individuals, ranging from occasional episodes separated by weeks to nightly occurrences. Some individuals experience the jerk multiple times in a single transition, the reflex firing repeatedly as the body oscillates between partial wakefulness and partial sleep before the transition finally consolidates into stable sleep. More frequent jerks do not indicate pathology. If you experience it nightly, your brainstem carries a sensitive falling detection threshold, a lower mismatch confidence level required to trigger the reflex. If you rarely experience it, your brainstem requires a stronger mismatch signal to trigger, a higher confidence threshold that filters out the weaker mismatch patterns the transition produces. Both are normal variations in the threshold of a preconscious reflex that every primate carries, variations that reflect individual differences in baroreceptor sensitivity, proprioceptive signaling strength, and the depth of the hypnagogic transition the brain produces each night. Neither variation indicates pathology. Neither variation predicts sleep quality. Neither variation requires treatment. My understanding of the closing image arrived when the evolutionary timeline met the following sensation: 60 million years of sleeping in trees, 2 million years of sleeping on the ground, the ancestral evaluation checking every night. The answer always the same: false alarm. The branch gone, the circuit persisting, the brainstem reaching. The jolt was never random. It was the fastest reflex the body produces, fired by a brainstem that interpreted the muscle relaxation of sleep onset as the beginning of a fall. Gravity sensor confirmed orientation. Muscles let go. The brainstem ran the falling assessment computation it has run across the evolutionary timeline. Catch yourself. The branch is gone. The algorithm remains. And every night, at the edge of sleep, your brainstem reaches for a branch that has not been there for 2 million years.